They say love is supposed to feel like warmth, like a place where your soul can finally rest. But what happens when the very people who claim to love you leave you feeling heavy, not broken, not hurt in obvious ways, just weighed down? You can't explain it. There are no harsh words, no visible wounds, and yet every time you're around them, something inside you tightens, your energy shifts, your peace quietly slips away. You start questioning yourself. Why do I feel like this if they love me? And that's the most confusing part, because this isn't about what they say. It's about what you feel in their presence. A silent pressure, an invisible weight, a kind of love that doesn't shout but somehow still suffocates. There's a kind of love that doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like weight. At first, it's almost impossible to recognize because nothing about it looks harmful on the surface. The words are kind, the gestures seem thoughtful, the connection appears real. But somewhere beneath all of that, there is a quiet pressure that begins to settle into your chest. You start to feel it in small moments, when you hesitate before speaking, when you overthink your reactions, when you find yourself adjusting just a little too much to keep the peace. It's subtle, so subtle that you question whether it's even there. Over time, that feeling grows. You notice that your energy shifts when you're around them. It's not dramatic, it doesn't explode into conflict, it lingers instead, like a quiet fog that follows you even after you leave. You feel drained, but you can't point to a clear reason. And that's what makes it so difficult to understand. Because how do you explain exhaustion when nothing wrong has happened? How do you justify the heaviness when all you've been given is something that looks like love? This is where many people begin to turn against themselves. They start believing the problem must be within them. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe I don't appreciate what I have. So they push their feelings aside. They silence that inner voice. They convince themselves to stay grateful, to stay present, to stay loyal. But the body doesn't lie. The mind can rationalize, but the spirit keeps records, and it whispers in quiet moments, reminding you that something doesn't feel right. Love, in its truest form, doesn't require you to shrink. It doesn't ask you to constantly adjust your tone, your thoughts, your identity, just to maintain harmony. Real love creates space. It allows you to breathe fully, to exist without fear of being too much or not enough. But when love carries weight, it begins to feel like you're carrying something invisible on your shoulders. You show up, you give, you try, but instead of feeling fulfilled, you feel depleted. And yet you stay, not because you're weak, but because you're human, because you see the good in them, because you remember the moments when it felt genuine, because part of you hopes that maybe, if you just try a little harder, things will feel lighter again. But here's the truth that many struggle to accept. Love should not feel like something you have to endure. It should not leave you questioning your worth or doubting your instincts. The hardest part is acknowledging what you feel without needing permission from anyone else to validate it, because when love feels heavy, it doesn't always come with obvious signs. It comes quietly, wrapped in normalcy, hidden behind smiles and routine. But your experience is real. That weight you feel, it matters. And recognizing it is not an act of betrayal, it's an act of awareness. There are moments in life when everything appears perfectly normal on the surface, yet something inside you refuses to settle. The conversations flow, the words are polite, even the laughter seems genuine. But beneath it all, there's a quiet discomfort you can't quite explain. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't demand attention. It lingers instead, in the pauses between sentences, in the way your body tenses without reason, in the subtle shift of your mood when certain people enter the room. And the most unsettling part is this: nothing obvious is wrong, yet nothing truly feels right. You begin to notice how your awareness sharpens in their presence. You listen more carefully, not just to what is being said, but to what isn't. You read between the lines, you analyze tone, timing, expressions. It's as if a part of you is constantly trying to decode something hidden beneath the surface. Not because you want to, but because something within you feels the need to stay alert. And over time, that alertness becomes exhausting. You're no longer just present in the moment. You're navigating an invisible undercurrent that no one else seems to acknowledge. This unspoken tension has a way of following you even after the interaction ends. You replay conversations in your mind, wondering why a certain comment felt heavier than it should have. You question your reactions, trying to understand why something so small left such a strong impression. And the more you think about it, the more confusing it becomes, because logically everything seems fine, but emotionally there's a quiet unrest that refuses to be ignored. What makes this even more difficult is the absence of clear evidence. There are no direct confrontations, no harsh words, no obvious signs of conflict, just a feeling, persistent, subtle, and deeply unsettling. And in a world that often values what can be seen and proven, feelings like these are easy to dismiss. You might tell yourself that you're imagining things, that you're reading too much into simple interactions, but deep down, there's a part of you that knows this isn't just imagination, it's awareness. The truth is, human connection is not built on words alone. It's shaped by energy, intention, and emotional presence. And sometimes, even when everything sounds right, something beneath it feels misaligned. That misalignment creates tension, not loud or aggressive, but quiet and constant. It's the kind of tension that makes you feel like you have to be careful, like you can't fully relax, like you're holding a part of yourself back without even realizing it. Over time, this takes a toll, not in a way that's immediately visible, but in a slow, subtle erosion of your peace. You become more guarded, more cautious, less open, not because you want to be, but because something within you is trying to protect you from a discomfort it cannot fully explain. And perhaps the most important thing to understand is this: just because you cannot clearly define the tension doesn't mean it isn't real. Not everything that affects you will come with clear labels or obvious signs. Sometimes the most powerful signals are the ones you feel but cannot easily put into words. And learning to trust that quiet awareness may be one of the most important steps toward understanding your own emotional truth. There's a strange kind of tension that doesn't come from arguments or harsh words. It comes from what is missing, from what is not said, not expressed, not acknowledged. You find yourself in conversations that sound normal, even pleasant, but something underneath feels unsettled. It's in the slight delay before they respond, the careful choice of words, the subtle shift in tone that you can't quite explain. Nothing is direct, nothing is obvious, yet your mind quietly registers that something isn't fully aligned. At first, you try to ignore it. You tell yourself it's nothing. Maybe you're just reading too deeply into things. Maybe you're tired. Maybe it's just one of those moments. But then it happens again and again, not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently enough that it begins to form a pattern. You start noticing how your body reacts before your mind even understands why. Your shoulders tense slightly. Your thoughts become more cautious. You choose your words more carefully, as if you're trying to avoid stepping into something invisible. And that's when it becomes exhausting, not because of conflict, but because of constant awareness. You're no longer just being in the moment. You're observing, analyzing, adjusting. You listen not just to what they say, but to how they say it. You pay attention to what they avoid, what they hesitate to mention, what feels slightly off. It's like standing in a room where the air feels heavier than it should be, even though no one else seems to notice. This kind of unspoken tension has a quiet way of following you long after the interaction ends. You replay moments in your mind trying to understand why something so small left such a deep impression. You ask yourself questions that don't have clear answers. Why did that feel uncomfortable? Why did I hold back just now? Why do I feel drained after something so ordinary? And the more you search for clarity, the more you realize that the answers aren't in the words, they're in the feeling. What makes this even more difficult is the absence of anything you can clearly point to. There's no obvious conflict to address, no specific moment to confront. It's just a quiet, persistent sense that something is off. And because of that, you might begin to doubt yourself. You might wonder if you're imagining things, if you're being too sensitive, if you're creating meaning where there is none. But deep down, there's a part of you that recognizes this feeling as real. The truth is, human connection goes far beyond spoken language. It lives in energy, in intention, in emotional presence, and when those elements don't align, you feel it, whether you can explain it or not. That unspoken tension is not always a sign of something dramatic, but it is often a sign that something isn't as genuine, as open, or as comfortable as it appears. Over time, if ignored, this tension begins to shape how you show up. You become more guarded without realizing it, more selective with what you share, less relaxed in your own presence. Not because you've changed, but because something in the environment has made you feel like you need to. And that quiet shift, that subtle withdrawal, is often your inner awareness trying to guide you, even when the situation itself remains undefined. There is a form of care that looks generous on the surface, but feels strangely heavy once you receive it. It doesn't arrive as control or demand. It comes wrapped in kindness, in thoughtful gestures, in moments that seem supportive and sincere. And because of that, you accept it without hesitation. You feel grateful, you feel seen, but slowly, almost invisibly, that care begins to carry a quiet expectation, one that is never clearly spoken, yet deeply felt. At first, it shows up in small ways: a favor that is remembered a little too often, a kind act that is gently brought up in conversation as if it holds more weight than it should. You begin to notice that every gesture seems to have an echo, something that lingers behind it, not enough to question directly, but enough to make you pause, enough to make you feel like there's something attached to what was given. And then, without realizing it, you begin to adjust. You respond more carefully. You say yes when you might have said no. You show up even when you feel drained, not because you're forced to, but because you feel an unspoken responsibility, a quiet sense that you owe something in return. And that's when care starts to feel less like a gift and more like a balance that must be maintained. This is how emotional weight builds, not through pressure that is obvious, but through expectations that are implied. You're never directly told what to do, yet you feel guided toward certain behaviors. You begin to act in ways that keep the peace, that maintain harmony, that avoid disrupting the invisible exchange that seems to exist. And over time, you start to lose track of what you genuinely want versus what you feel obligated to give. What makes this dynamic so difficult to recognize is that it doesn't look harmful. There are no raised voices, no clear demands, no visible control. From the outside, it may even look like a healthy connection, one where people care for each other, support each other, give and receive. But internally, something feels off because true care doesn't come with quiet conditions. It doesn't make you feel like you're keeping score, like you're constantly balancing what was given with what must be returned. You might find yourself feeling guilty for even noticing this. After all, how can you question someone who has been good to you? How can you doubt care that appears genuine? And so instead of addressing it, you carry it. You carry the weight of unspoken expectations. You carry the pressure to respond in the right way. You carry the subtle fear of disappointing someone who has shown you kindness. But here's where clarity begins. Real care doesn't create emotional debt. It doesn't leave you feeling like you owe your time, your energy, or your peace in return. It flows freely, without keeping track, without creating silent agreements that you never consciously accepted. When care is genuine, it feels light, it feels safe, it allows you to receive without pressure and give without fear. And when it doesn't feel that way, when it feels like something you have to maintain, protect, or repay, it's worth paying attention. Not with judgment, not with immediate conclusions, but with awareness. Because sometimes the heaviest burdens are not the ones forced upon us, but the ones we quietly accept, believing they are simply the cost of being loved. There's a quiet kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being surrounded by people who claim to care yet never truly see you. On the surface, everything appears intact. You talk, you share moments, you exist in the same space. But beneath that, there is a growing realization that something essential is missing. Not attention, not presence, but understanding. The kind that doesn't require explanation, the kind that simply feels you without needing constant translation. At first, you try to bridge that gap. You explain yourself more clearly. You choose your words carefully. You open up, hoping that if you just express things the right way, they will finally understand what's going on inside you. But something doesn't land. Your words are heard, but not fully received. They respond, but it feels like they're responding to a version of you that isn't entirely real. And slowly, that creates a distance that words cannot fix. So you begin to adjust, not all at once, not dramatically, but in small, quiet ways. You share a little less, you simplify your thoughts, you avoid topics that feel too deep, too personal, too difficult to explain. It becomes easier to stay on the surface than to risk being misunderstood again. And without realizing it, you start to disconnect, not from them entirely, but from the parts of yourself that never seem to find a place in the conversation. This is where the real weight begins to form, because it's one thing to be alone and know it. It's another to feel alone in the presence of people who believe they are close to you. There's a silent tension in that space, a feeling of being present but not fully seen, heard but not fully understood. And over time, that tension turns into exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, but emotional fatigue from constantly trying to be understood and quietly accepting when you're not. You might question yourself in moments like these. Wonder if you're expecting too much. Wonder if complete understanding is even realistic. And yes, no one can fully know every part of you, but there is a difference between not knowing everything and not truly trying to understand at all. That difference is subtle, but deeply felt. It shows up in how people listen, how they respond, how they make space for who you are, not just who they're comfortable with. As this pattern continues, silence becomes your refuge. Not because you have nothing to say, but because speaking no longer feels meaningful. You learn to carry your thoughts internally, to process your emotions alone, to exist within yourself rather than reaching outward. And while that may bring temporary peace, it also deepens the distance between you and those around you. The truth is, being misunderstood repeatedly can slowly reshape how you show up in the world. You become more guarded, more selective, more reserved, not out of coldness, but out of protection. Because there's only so many times you can try to be seen before you begin to accept invisibility as a form of safety. And yet, deep down, a part of you still longs for that connection, the kind where you don't have to explain every detail, where your presence is enough to be understood. Recognizing that absence is not weakness, it's awareness, because love that truly connects doesn't just hear your words, it understands your silence too. There comes a moment when the mind is still trying to make sense of everything, but something deeper within you has already reached a quiet conclusion. It doesn't arrive as a loud decision, it doesn't come with dramatic clarity. It shows up as a feeling, subtle, persistent, and impossible to ignore, a sense that you need space, not because you're angry, not because you want to disconnect completely, but because something inside you is asking for relief. At first, you hesitate to trust that feeling. You question it. You analyze it. You try to reason your way out of it. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I just need time. Maybe things will feel different tomorrow. And so you stay where you are. You continue the routine. You engage. You respond. You show up the way you always have. But that quiet voice doesn't fade. If anything, it becomes clearer the more you ignore it. You begin to notice how your energy shifts in their presence, how your thoughts become heavier, slower, more cautious. You're no longer fully relaxed. You're aware, measured, slightly withdrawn, not in an obvious way, but enough for you to feel the difference within yourself. And it's in these moments that you realize something important. Your body is responding to something your mind hasn't fully accepted yet. Distance, in this sense, is not rejection. It's not an act of punishment or coldness. It's a form of self-preservation, a quiet boundary that says, I need to breathe differently. But because the connection isn't clearly harmful, stepping back feels complicated. You wonder if it's justified. You wonder if it's fair. You worry about how it will be perceived. And so, instead of creating space, you try to manage the discomfort internally. But internal management has its limits. You can only silence your instincts for so long before they begin to surface in other ways, through fatigue, through irritability, through a quiet sense of disconnection from yourself, and eventually you're faced with a choice: continue ignoring what you feel or begin honoring it even if it doesn't make perfect sense yet. Choosing space doesn't mean you stop caring. It doesn't mean you erase the connection or deny the good that exists. It simply means you are listening to yourself enough to recognize when something no longer feels right for your well-being. And that kind of awareness requires honesty, and honesty that doesn't rely on external validation. What makes this step powerful is its quiet nature. There's no need for confrontation, no need for dramatic explanations. Sometimes the most meaningful shifts happen internally, reflected only in the way you begin to show up differently. You create small boundaries. You protect your time. You limit how much of your energy is given, not out of resentment, but out of respect for your own balance. And slowly, as that space forms, something begins to change. The heaviness that once felt constant starts to lift. Your thoughts become clearer. Your energy feels lighter. You begin to reconnect with a version of yourself that isn't shaped by tension or quiet pressure. And in that clarity, you start to understand something deeply important. Love should never feel like something you have to recover from. Sometimes the most powerful decision you can make isn't loud or visible. It's the quiet choice to step back, to breathe, to listen to what your spirit has been trying to tell you all along, and to trust that protecting your peace is not something you need to justify.